The system always fails quietly before it screams, and Ethan Cole had learned to listen for the silence. The air in Sector C tasted faintly metallic, like overheated wiring hidden behind polished walls, a detail no one else seemed to notice as executives and high-tier aliens passed through the corridor without a glance, their polished boots echoing in clean, indifferent rhythm. Ethan crouched beside an access panel barely visible at floor level, fingers steady despite the low hum of current biting at his skin, his worn gloves long since burned through at the tips, exposing pale human skin to the sting of live circuitry. The panel slid open with a reluctant hiss, revealing a mess of fiber lines glowing unevenly, one flickering just half a second out of sync, a flaw so small it wouldn't register on any automated diagnostic, but Ethan saw it instantly. He always did. Above him, a massive viewport stretched across the station's spine, showing a curve of distant stars and the slow drift of cargo vessels, silent against the vacuum, beautiful in a way that felt almost unreal compared to the cramped maintenance crawl spaces he spent most of his life inside. He adjusted the connection with a careful twist, ignoring the sharp pulse of heat that traveled up his arm, breath tightening just slightly before evening out again, and the flicker stopped. Just like that. No alert, no acknowledgement, just stability, restored before anyone knew it had been threatened. Footsteps approached, lighter this time, deliberate, and he didn't look up until a shadow crossed over him, tall and unmistakably out of place in a sector meant for workers. Lysera Vahn stood there, her presence bending the space around her more than gravity ever could, skin glowing faintly under the station lights, a soft blue that seemed almost liquid, her expression calm, distant, calculating. Her eyes moved past him at first, scanning the corridor, the infrastructure, everything but the human kneeling at her feet. "Maintenance," she said finally, voice smooth and precise, as if the word itself carried no weight. Ethan wiped his hand against his worn uniform, leaving a faint streak of dark residue before pushing himself up, keeping a respectful distance without quite stepping back. "System stable," he replied simply. She tilted her head, just slightly, studying him now as if noticing a detail that didn't belong. "It was never reported as unstable," she said. Ethan gave a small shrug, almost imperceptible. It would have been. For a moment, the station seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum aligning perfectly with the silence between them. Lysera's gaze sharpened, something curious flickering beneath the surface of her composure. Not interest exactly, but recognition of something she couldn't immediately categorize. Around them, life continued without pause, distant conversations, passing figures, the endless motion of a system that believed itself flawless. But Ethan had already turned back to the open panel, fingers moving again, checking connections that hadn't failed yet, fixing problems that hadn't happened, because he knew they would. And somewhere behind him, unnoticed by everyone else, the most powerful woman on the station didn't walk away. The panel should have stayed quiet, but Ethan did not close it. Not yet, because the silence still felt wrong, like a heartbeat skipping just once in a body too large to notice its own weakness. And behind him, he could still feel her presence, unmoving, watching in a way that was not curiosity but calculation, as if she was measuring something that did not fit inside her understanding of how systems were supposed to work. He reached deeper into the wiring, adjusting a secondary relay that had not failed but would within the next 40 minutes if left untouched, his movements precise, almost instinctive, like he was following a pattern only he could see. "You repair what is broken," Lysera said, her voice softer now, less dismissive, though still carrying that distant edge of authority. "But you are working on something that has not failed." Ethan paused just long enough to answer, eyes still on the faint pulse of light running through the cables. "It will," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no guesswork, just quiet certainty. The overhead lights flickered once, so subtle it could have been dismissed as a fluctuation, but the next corridor overdimmed for half a second before stabilizing again, and this time Lysera noticed. Her gaze shifted upward, then back to him, something sharper forming behind her calm expression. "How did you know?" she asked, and for the first time it sounded like a real question, not an observation dressed as one. Ethan tightened the connection and sealed the line, the hum evening out into a smooth, stable tone that blended back into the station's constant background noise. "I listen," he said simply, pushing himself back to his feet, wiping his hands again even though the marks never fully came off. Systems talk before they fail. Most people just are not paying attention. Lysera stepped closer now, close enough that the faint glow of her skin reflected off the metal panel, her presence filling the narrow space with something almost electric. "Machines do not talk," she replied, but there was no dismissal in it this time, only a quiet challenge. Ethan met her gaze briefly, then looked past her toward the long corridor stretching into the distance, where workers moved like shadows and executives like constellations, bright and untouchable. "Everything talks," he said. "You just have to care enough to hear it." The words hung there, simple and unpolished, yet they carried something that did not belong in a place built entirely on efficiency and profit margins. For a moment, Lysera said nothing, her eyes studying him as if recalibrating a system that had just produced an unexpected result. Somewhere deeper in the station, a low warning tone began to form, not yet an alarm, just the first whisper of imbalance, and Ethan turned his head slightly toward it before anyone else reacted, already moving before the sound fully registered. He stepped past her without asking, heading toward the source with the same steady urgency, leaving behind the open panel and the quiet evidence of something fixed before it could break. Lysera remained where she was, watching him disappear into the flow of the station, her mind processing variables that did not align, because the system had not reported a fault, the diagnostics had shown nothing, and yet the human had known, had acted, had corrected it before it became visible, and for the first time since she arrived, the station did not feel entirely under her control. The warning tone grew stronger as Ethan moved, not loud enough to trigger a station-wide alert, but sharp enough to cut through the background hum like a thread being pulled too tight. And he followed it without hesitation, weaving through corridors where polished glass gave way to exposed steel, and the air felt warmer by a few degrees, heavy with the scent of overworked systems. He reached a sealed maintenance hatch and pressed his palm against the access pad, already knowing it would deny him, already anticipating the delay, and when the red light blinked back at him, he did not waste time arguing with it, instead dropping to one knee and opening a secondary panel along the wall, fingers slipping inside to manually override a lock that had not been designed to be touched without tools. Behind him, footsteps approached again, measured, unhurried, and he did not need to turn to know she had followed. "This sector is restricted," Lysera said, her voice carrying that quiet authority that usually ended conversations before they began, but Ethan was already pulling the hatch open, the seal releasing with a low hiss as warmer air spilled out, carrying the unmistakable scent of stress circuitry. "Then your system should have fixed it," he replied, not disrespectful, just factual, and he slipped inside before she could respond, leaving the hatch open behind him. For a fraction of a second, Lysera stood there, staring at the open entry point like it was something that should not exist, something that violated the clean, controlled design of everything she owned, and then she stepped forward and followed. Inside, the space narrowed into a crawl tunnel lined with cables that pulsed unevenly, light traveling through them in stuttering waves instead of smooth flows, and Ethan moved quickly, shoulders brushing against the metal walls, breath steady despite the rising temperature. "Temperature is climbing," he said, more to himself than to her, glancing at a small handheld meter clipped to his belt, its display flickering between readings that did not quite stabilize. 3 degrees above baseline and rising. Lysera watched him navigate the space with an ease that did not come from training alone, but from familiarity, from time spent listening to systems no one else considered worth hearing. "There was no report of instability in this sector," she said again, but the certainty in her voice had begun to thin, replaced by something quieter, something closer to doubt. Ethan reached a junction where several lines converged, one of them glowing brighter than the rest, its light flickering in irregular pulses that echoed the tone still building somewhere deeper in the station. He placed his hand against it briefly, eyes closing for half a second like he was feeling something beyond heat, beyond vibration. "It is not failing yet," he said, "but it is about to choose the wrong path." Lysera frowned slightly, the words not fitting into any system. Logic she recognized. "Machines do not choose," she said, though the statement felt weaker now, less absolute. Ethan opened his eyes and began rerouting the line, movements careful, deliberate, each adjustment small but precise. They follow patterns, he said, and patterns break when no one is watching. The cable dimmed slightly as he shifted the flow, the irregular pulses smoothing out, the warning tone easing just enough to fade back into the background, not gone, but delayed. He exhaled slowly, tension leaving his shoulders in a way that suggested he had been carrying more than just the physical strain. Lysera remained still in the narrow space, her gaze fixed on the now stable line, processing the sequence of events that had unfolded without permission from her systems, without authorization, without any of the controls she relied on. You corrected it before it became a failure, she said, more to herself than to him. And there was something different in her tone now, something that was no longer dismissive. Ethan secured the panel and shifted back slightly to give her room, though the space did not allow much distance. That is the job, he said quietly. She studied him for a long moment, the faint glow of her skin reflecting off the metal walls, illuminating the worn edges of his uniform, the subtle burns along his fingertips, the signs of work that no report ever recorded. No, she said finally, voice low, almost thoughtful. That is not the job. And for the first time since she had arrived, Lysera Vahn began to wonder if the most valuable part of her station was something her systems had never accounted for. The heat lingered even after the system stabilized, a quiet reminder that something beneath the surface had almost gone unnoticed, and Ethan stayed there a few seconds longer than necessary, eyes tracing the lines one last time, as if confirming that the station had returned to breathing normally, slow and steady instead of strained and uneven. When he finally shifted back toward the hatch, the narrow space forced him close to Lysera again, the faint glow of her presence casting soft reflections across the metal, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence between them heavier than before, not empty, but filled with something unspoken. If it was not failing yet, she said, her voice lower now, measured. Why did you come here first? Ethan brushed a hand along the side panel as he passed, sealing it with a practiced motion before glancing back at her, not quite meeting her eyes this time. Because no one else would, he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, just a simple truth delivered without weight. They stepped back into the main corridor, the air cooler, cleaner, the distant hum of the station smooth again as if nothing had ever been wrong, and already people were moving past them, unaware of how close the system had come to slipping out of alignment. Lysera watched them pass, her gaze shifting between the flawless surface of the station and the man beside her whose presence seemed to exist outside of its awareness. My systems are designed to detect and correct inefficiencies before they escalate, she said, almost as if reminding herself. Ethan nodded once, wiping his hands again, though the faint burn marks along his fingers remained. They are, he agreed, but they only see what they are told to look for. He started walking, not toward the upper levels where executives gathered behind glass and controlled environments, but deeper into the working spine of the station where lights were dimmer and the sounds more honest, where systems did not hide behind perfect reports. Lysera followed without announcing it, her steps quieter now, less commanding, as if she was no longer certain that she understood the rules of the space she owned. They passed a small service alcove where a young alien worker struggled with a faulty panel, its interface flickering between commands that did not respond, frustration clear in the way her hands hovered uncertainly over the controls. Ethan slowed, then stopped, watching for just a second before stepping in without introduction. Try resetting the secondary input buffer, he said, voice calm, guiding rather than correcting. The worker hesitated, then followed his instruction, the panel stabilizing almost instantly as the flicker smoothed into a steady glow. Relief crossed her face, subtle but unmistakable, and she nodded in quiet thanks before returning to her task. Ethan did not wait for acknowledgement, already moving on as if the moment required nothing more. Lysera lingered half a step behind, her eyes moving between the worker and the now stable panel, processing something that did not fit into efficiency metrics or profit margins. You intervened for a minor issue, she said as she caught up to him. It did not affect core operations. Ethan kept walking, gaze forward, expression neutral. It would have, he said, just not where anyone important would notice. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than they sounded, and for the first time Lysera did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched him as he moved through the station, seeing how he slowed at certain junctions, how he listened before acting, how his attention drifted not to the most critical systems, but to the ones most likely to be ignored. Somewhere in the distance, another faint irregularity began to form, not yet a sound, just a subtle shift in the rhythm of the station's hum, and Ethan's head tilted slightly, catching it without effort. He changed direction without explanation, already moving toward the next unseen fracture before it could surface. Lysera remained where she was for a moment longer, the corridor stretching out before her, perfect and controlled, yet now she could feel the gaps within it, the places her systems did not reach, the silence they did not understand, and as she followed him again, it was no longer to observe, but to learn what her empire had been missing all along. The station sounded different once you knew how to listen, not louder, not broken, just layered with quiet inconsistencies that most beings filtered out as background noise. And Ethan moved through it like someone walking through rain, adjusting his pace without thinking, turning corners before the reason fully formed, while Lysera followed a step behind, her mind trying to map logic onto instincts that refused to align with any system she had built. The corridor narrowed again as they reached a junction feeding into a mid-level habitation ring. The air here cooler but uneven, carrying faint shifts in pressure that made the lights hum at a slightly higher pitch, and Ethan slowed, eyes lifting toward a ventilation grid overhead. "Airflow is off," he said, almost to himself, already scanning for access points. And without waiting, he climbed onto a low-maintenance rail, reaching up to loosen the panel with a small tool pulled from his belt. Lysera watched the motion, the ease of it, the lack of hesitation, and more importantly, the lack of permission requested. "There is no alert for atmospheric imbalance," she said, though her voice no longer carried the same certainty it once had. Ethan glanced down briefly, offering the faintest hint of a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Give it 10 minutes, he replied, pulling the grid free as a soft rush of air spilled downward, warmer than it should have been. Inside, the ducts showed a subtle buildup along one side, a restriction small enough to pass initial scans, but significant enough to shift flow patterns over time, and he reached in carefully, clearing the obstruction and adjusting a regulator valve by a fraction of an inch. The change was immediate but quiet, the airflow smoothing into balance, the hum of the lights settling back into a stable tone that most would never notice had changed at all. He dropped back to the floor, securing the panel as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just prevented an entire section from drifting into discomfort that would eventually escalate into system strain. Lysera stepped closer, her gaze fixed not on the vent, but on him. "You correct outcomes before they exist," she said, the words slower now, more deliberate, as if she was choosing them carefully. Ethan brushed dust from his hands, shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension in the air dissipated. "I just pay attention," he answered, though even he knew that was not the whole truth. They resumed walking, but the rhythm had changed, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with questions neither had fully formed yet. And as they moved deeper into the station, the polished surfaces gave way to more exposed infrastructure, the kind of places where systems showed their imperfections instead of hiding them. "Who trained you?" Lysera asked after a moment, her tone quieter than before, stripped of command and closer to curiosity. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes tracking a faint vibration along a wall panel, confirming that it was stable before continuing. "No one," he said finally, "not really." She studied him, the response not fitting any known pathway of skill development or expertise acquisition. "That is not possible," she said, though the conviction behind it was fading. Ethan let out a slow breath, the sound almost lost in the background hum. "Maybe it is not," he replied, "but it is what happened." Ahead of them, a cluster of workers gathered around a console, their voices low, uncertain, the screen displaying a pattern of readings that fluctuated just enough to cause concern without triggering an alert, and Ethan's pace shifted again, faster now, drawn toward the anomaly like it was calling him by name. Lysera followed without thinking, her focus no longer on the station itself, but on the human moving through it like he understood something deeper than code or command structures, something that could not be installed or programmed. As he reached the console and began adjusting inputs with quiet confidence, stabilizing a pattern that had not yet failed, Lysera felt something unfamiliar settle into her awareness, not a system error, not a miscalculation, but a realization that her empire, for all its precision, had been built on the assumption that everything important could be measured, and standing in front of her was proof that it could not. The console stabilized under Ethan's hands, the erratic readings smoothing into a steady pattern that blended back into the station's endless stream of data, and the workers around him exhaled almost in unison, their tension dissolving into quiet relief they did not fully understand. He stepped back without waiting for thanks, already scanning the edges of the display for anything that still felt out of place, his eyes moving not just across numbers but through them, as if he was listening to something behind the data itself. Lysera stood just behind him, watching the subtle shift in the room, the way uncertainty gave way to calm without any formal announcement. No system alert, no directive issued, just a quiet correction that prevented something larger from forming. "You saw it before it became visible," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear it. Ethan glanced at the screen one last time, then turned away, his attention already drifting toward a distant hum that most would never isolate from the background noise. "It was already visible," he replied, "just not in a way your systems recognize." They moved away from the console, the workers returning to their routines, their confidence restored without knowing why, and as they walked, the station seemed to shift again, not physically, but perceptually, as if layers were being peeled back from something Lysera had always believed was complete. "Explain that," she said after a moment, her tone no longer commanding but searching, as if she was asking a question she had never needed to ask before. Ethan slowed slightly, considering the words as much as the concept behind them, something he had never tried to define out loud. "Your systems measure outcomes," he said, "temperature, pressure, efficiency, failure rates. They wait for something to cross a threshold before they react." He paused, tilting his head as a faint vibration passed through the floor beneath them, subtle enough to ignore, but not to him. "I listened to the space before the threshold," he continued, "the part where things start to drift but have not broken yet." Lysera absorbed the explanation, her mind translating it into frameworks she understood, then rejecting them one by one because none of them quite fit. "That is not data," she said, more softly now. Ethan gave a small nod. "No," he agreed, "it is not." They reached a wider corridor where the station opened into a viewing platform, the vast curve of space stretching out beyond reinforced glass, stars scattered like distant signals across an endless dark. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the quiet rhythm of a system that believed itself stable. "Then what is it?" she asked finally. Ethan leaned lightly against the railing, his reflection faint in the glass, layered over the distant stars. "It is attention," he said, "not the kind you program, the kind you choose." The words settled into the space between them, simple, almost unremarkable, yet carrying a weight that shifted something deeper than logic. Lysera looked out at the stars, her empire stretching across systems, built on precision, control, prediction, and yet standing here, she could feel the limits of all of it, the edges where her understanding stopped. "Attention does not scale," she said after a moment, the statement more observation than argument. Ethan nodded again, not disagreeing. "No," he said, "it does not." Another faint irregularity rippled through the station's hum, distant, barely there, and Ethan's gaze shifted instantly, locking onto it like a compass finding north. He pushed away from the railing without hesitation, already moving, the rhythm of his steps aligning with something unseen. Lysera did not hesitate this time, following immediately, her focus no longer on the system she controlled, but on the man who seemed to understand it in a way she could not replicate. And as she followed him deeper into the station once more, she began to realize that whatever his secret was, it was not just hidden from her systems, it was something her entire empire had never learned how to see. The irregularity was softer this time, not a tone or a flicker, but a subtle delay in the station's rhythm, like a breath held just a fraction too long, and Ethan adjusted his pace instinctively, cutting through a cross corridor without checking the signage, his path guided by something that could not be plotted on any map. Lysera followed close behind, her steps matching his now, not out of command but out of necessity, because whatever he was sensing, it was faster than any system she could access. The corridor opened into a mid-tier transit junction where streams of beings moved in organized flows, guided by lights and signals that kept everything efficient, predictable, controlled. And yet Ethan slowed again, his gaze drifting upward toward a suspended relay cluster that pulsed with a faint, uneven glow. "There," he said quietly, already moving toward a service ladder embedded in the wall, and before anyone could question it, he was climbing, hands gripping metal rungs worn smooth by years of use. Lysera remained below for only a second before following, her movements precise but less practiced, the height irrelevant to her focus as she reached the platform beside him. Up close, the relay cluster revealed its flaw, not a failure, not even a malfunction, just a slight desynchronization between two parallel signal paths, one lagging behind the other by a margin too small to trigger correction protocols, but large enough to compound over time. Ethan crouched beside it, studying the pattern with narrowed eyes, his fingers hovering just above the interface without touching it yet. "It is still within acceptable parameters," Lysera said, reading the faint indicators along the cluster's surface, her voice carrying a trace of the old certainty, though it felt more like a habit now than a belief. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of it without agreeing with the conclusion. "For now," he said, and then he reached in, adjusting a calibration point by a fraction so small it barely registered his movement. But the effect was immediate, the two signals aligning perfectly, their pulses merging into a single, stable rhythm. The change was invisible to the crowd below, unnoticed by every system that had deemed the deviation acceptable, but the station itself seemed to settle, the underlying tension easing in a way that could only be felt, not measured. Lysera watched the shift, her eyes tracking the indicators, confirming what she could see while trying to understand what she could not. "You correct deviations before they become inefficiencies," she said, her voice quieter now, less analytical, more reflective. Ethan secured the panel and sat back slightly, the metal platform cool beneath him, the hum of the relay now smooth and consistent. "I correct them before they become someone else's problem," he replied, and this time there was something deeper in his tone, something that carried beyond systems and into something more human, more deliberate. Below them, the flow of traffic continued, unaware of the correction that had just preserved its order, and for a moment, Lysera looked down at it differently, not as a system to be optimized, but as something more fragile than she had ever considered. "Your role is maintenance," she said, though the word felt insufficient now, too small for what she was witnessing. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze following hers toward the moving crowd, then shifting back to the relay above them. "That is what they call it," he said. She studied him, the faint glow of her skin reflecting in the polished surfaces around them, illuminating details she had overlooked before, the wear in his uniform, the subtle signs of strain in his movements, the evidence of someone who had been carrying unseen responsibilities for a long time. "And what do you call it?" she asked. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he did not know, but because he had never needed to say it out loud. "I keep things from breaking," he said finally, simple, direct, and somehow far more than the words themselves. The station hummed around them, vast and intricate, a network of systems designed to run without interruption, and yet in that moment, Lysera began to understand that its stability did not come from perfection, but from someone who noticed the imperfections first, someone who chose to care about them before they mattered. And as she climbed down from the platform beside him, following him once again into the flow of the station, she realized that whatever his secret was, it was not just hidden, it was something that could not be replicated, because it was not built into him. It was something he chose, over and over again, in ways her systems had never been designed to understand. The station felt almost calm now, but Ethan knew better than to trust calm, because calm was just the space where unnoticed problems waited to grow, and as he stepped off the transit platform, his pace slowed, not from uncertainty, but from listening, his attention stretching outward like a net cast into silence. Lysera followed beside him now instead of behind, her movements no longer guided by status or distance, but by something quieter, something closer to alignment. And for the first time, she was not scanning her internal systems for answers. She was watching him instead. They entered a service corridor that connected to one of the residential sectors, the lighting softer here, the air steady, the hum of the station even enough to suggest everything was functioning as designed. And yet Ethan stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a small shift in his stride, a pause that most would not notice, but Lysera did. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low, almost instinctive now. Ethan did not answer right away, his head tilting slightly as if trying to isolate a sound buried beneath layers of noise. And then he moved, not toward a panel or a console, but toward a closed door along the corridor wall, one that showed no warning lights, no alerts, nothing that would justify concern. He pressed his hand lightly against it, feeling rather than scanning, and then he knocked. There was a delay, just long enough to confirm that something inside was not responding the way it should, and then the door slid open with a soft mechanical glide. Inside, the room was small, dimly lit. A single occupant seated near a terminal that flickered between stable and unstable states, the glow reflecting faintly across tired features and unfocused eyes. The being looked up, startled at first, then confused, as if unsure why anyone had come. "The interface is lagging," Ethan said gently, stepping inside without hesitation, his voice softer now, stripped of the technical edge it carried in the corridors. The occupant nodded slowly, frustration and fatigue mixing in a way that did not show up on any system report. "It keeps freezing," they said, voice uneven, "but it never triggers a fault." Ethan moved to the terminal, his fingers brushing the surface lightly before accessing a hidden layer of settings most users never saw, adjusting a synchronization parameter by a fraction, rerouting a minor process that had been building resistance over time. The screen steadied almost instantly, the flicker gone, the delay smoothed into responsiveness that felt natural again. The occupant blinked, then exhaled, relief settling into their posture in a way that no diagnostic would ever record. "Thank you," they said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, already stepping back. Lysera stood at the doorway, watching the exchange, and something about it unsettled her more than any system flaw had. There was no efficiency gained here, no measurable impact on operations, no report that would justify the time spent, and yet the effect was undeniable. As Ethan stepped back into the corridor, she followed, her gaze lingering for a moment on the now stable terminal before shifting back to him. "That did not affect the station," she said, though the statement lacked conviction. Ethan kept walking, his eyes already scanning the corridor ahead, listening for the next inconsistency. "It affected someone on it," he replied, and there was no need to say more. The words settled into her thoughts, quiet but persistent, and for the first time Lysera understood that his pattern was not just about systems. It was about people, about the unseen connections between stability and experience, between function and feeling, things her empire had never accounted for because they could not be measured. The station hummed around them, vast and intricate, and as she walked beside him, she began to see it differently, not as a perfect machine, but as something that required more than perfection to keep it whole, something that needed someone who would notice what did not matter until it did, someone who would stop, even when there was no reason to, because they chose to care anyway. The corridor felt quieter after they left the small room, but not empty, never empty, because Ethan could still feel the station breathing around them, a constant exchange of motion and pressure and unseen signals that most beings filtered out without realizing what they were losing. He walked slower now, not because there was less to fix, but because something else had shifted, something in the way Lysera moved beside him, her presence no longer distant or observing, but attentive, like she was trying to hear what he heard without knowing how. They reached a junction where multiple systems converged, power, communication, environmental control, all feeding into a central node hidden behind seamless architecture, designed to look flawless from the outside, and Ethan stopped again, not at the panel, but a few steps away from it. His eyes narrowed slightly, not at a visible flaw, but at something deeper, something that did not align. "Something is off," he said quietly, more certain than concerned, and this time Lysera did not question it. Instead, She stepped closer to the node, accessing her internal interface, pulling up layers of data in an instant, streams of metrics flowing through her awareness faster than any manual system could display. All systems are within optimal parameters, she said after a moment, her voice calm, precise. But there was a hesitation now, a fraction of uncertainty that had not existed before. Ethan did not move toward the panel right away. Instead, he listened, his head tilting slightly, eyes unfocused as if he was tracking something moving just out of sight. It is not the systems, he said slowly. It is how they are talking to each other. Lysera frowned, her data streams shifting, recalculating, searching for a variable that matched his description, but there was nothing, no error, no delay significant enough to register. There is no communication fault, she said, though the words felt thinner now, less absolute. Ethan stepped forward at last, placing his hand lightly against the surface of the node, feeling the faint vibrations running through it, the subtle inconsistencies in timing that did not show up as failure, only as tension. There will be, he replied, and then he moved, accessing a maintenance layer that required physical input, something her systems rarely relied on anymore. His fingers worked through the interface, not forcing changes, but guiding them, adjusting synchronization points between subsystems that had drifted just enough to fall out of harmony. It was not a repair in the traditional sense, not replacing a broken part or correcting a measurable error. It was more like tuning, bringing separate elements back into alignment before they began to conflict. The effect was almost immediate, though nothing visible changed, no alerts cleared, no warnings disappeared, and yet the station's hum shifted, becoming smoother, more coherent, like a rhythm finding its balance again. Lysera felt it this time, not through data, but directly, a subtle easing in the background noise that her systems had never translated into meaning. I did not detect that, she said quietly, the admission simple but significant. Ethan stepped back, sealing the panel, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension faded. You are not meant to, he said, not dismissive, just honest. She looked at him then, really looked, not at his role, not at his status, but at the way he moved through her station as if it were something alive, something that needed more than oversight to remain whole. Then what are you? She asked, the question coming out before she could refine it, before she could shape it into something more controlled. Ethan hesitated, not because he did not understand the question, but because the answer was not something he had ever needed to define. He glanced around the corridor, at the seamless surfaces, the hidden systems, the countless interactions happening without awareness. I am just someone who notices, he said finally, and the simplicity of it made it sound smaller than it was. Lysera held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something behind the words, something measurable, something she could categorize, but there was nothing there except quiet certainty. And as they stood there in the center of a system that should have been perfect, she began to understand that his secret was not a function or a design, it was a choice, one her entire empire had never considered making. The station should have remained stable after the last correction, the systems aligned, the signals synchronized, the invisible tension eased back into balance, but Ethan did not move on right away, and that alone was enough to shift the air between them. He stood there a moment longer than usual, his head tilted slightly, as if he was listening for something that had not yet arrived, something distant and faint but growing. Lysera watched him, her gaze no longer searching for flaws in the system, but for changes in him, because she had begun to understand that whatever he sensed came before her data, before her control, before anything she could measure. There is more, she said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the steady hum of the station, and then he nodded once. Yeah, he said, and there was something heavier in it this time, something that did not belong to minor deviations or small corrections. He turned, not toward a nearby panel or corridor, but toward a direction that led deeper into the station's core infrastructure, a place where most workers never went and most systems did not need to look, because everything there was supposed to be self-regulating, self-correcting, perfect. Lysera hesitated for only a fraction of a second before following, her steps matching his pace without hesitation, because whatever this was, she could feel it now too, not as data, but as a subtle distortion in the station's rhythm, like a note played just slightly off in a song that should have been flawless. As they moved, the corridors changed, the polished surfaces giving way to reinforced structures, the lighting dimmer, the air warmer by a few degrees, carrying a faint trace of energy buildup that had not yet crossed any threshold. Ethan's pace increased, his movements more direct now, less exploratory, as if the pattern ahead had become clearer, more urgent. "What is it?" Lysera asked, her voice steady. But there was something beneath it now, something that resembled concern. Ethan did not slow down. "A delay," he said, small but spreading. They reached a sealed access point leading into a core distribution hub, the interface glowing steady green, indicating full operational integrity, no faults, no warnings, nothing that would justify intervention. Lysera accessed her internal systems instantly, layers of data unfolding in perfect clarity. "All systems are optimal," she said, but this time the words felt wrong even as she said them, like repeating a fact that no longer held meaning. Ethan stepped closer to the panel, placing his hand against it, eyes closing for just a second, as if he was feeling something beyond the surface, and then he opened them again, sharper now. "They are out of sync," he said, just enough to cancel each other out. Lysera frowned, her data streams recalculating, searching for interference patterns, latency mismatches, anything that could explain what he was describing. But there was nothing, no measurable conflict, no visible disruption. "That is not possible," she said, though the certainty was gone now, replaced by something quieter, something closer to doubt. Ethan did not argue. He just moved, bypassing the standard interface and opening a manual access point hidden beneath the panel, something designed for emergencies that had not yet been declared. The hatch released with a low hiss, warmer air spilling out, carrying the faint scent of overstressed systems that had not yet failed but were approaching a point where they might. He stepped inside without hesitation, and this time Lysera followed immediately, not out of curiosity, but because she understood now that waiting for proof meant arriving too late. Inside, the hub revealed itself as a network of converging lines, power, data, environmental control, all intersecting in a complex pattern that should have been perfectly balanced. And yet Ethan moved through it with focused urgency, his eyes tracking something invisible, something that existed between the signals rather than within them. "There," he said, reaching a central junction where multiple flows overlapped, each one stable on its own, but slightly misaligned with the others. He began adjusting them, not forcefully, but carefully, guiding each stream back into alignment with the others, his movements precise, controlled, like tuning an instrument rather than repairing a machine. The effect built slowly, not immediate, not obvious, but the tension in the air began to ease, the underlying hum smoothing out into something coherent again. Lysera felt it this time without needing to check her systems, a shift so subtle it should not have mattered, and yet it did, in a way she could not quantify. "If you had not done that," she said quietly, watching the line settle into balance, "what would have happened?" Ethan paused, his hand resting lightly against the junction, as if confirming the correction was holding. "Nothing," he said at first, then after a second, "not right away." He stepped back, sealing the access point, the system returning to its flawless appearance, no record of the near misalignment, no trace of what had almost formed. Lysera looked at the panel, then at him, her understanding shifting in a way that could not be reversed. "And later?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze for a brief moment, then looked past her toward the endless structure of the station. "Later," he said, "it would have mattered." And for the first time since she built this place, Lysera realized that her greatest risk had never been failure. It had been the quiet moments before it, the ones her systems were never designed to see. The system returned to silence, but this time it did not feel stable. It felt like something holding its breath, and Ethan remained still for a moment after sealing the panel, his hand resting against the metal as if confirming something deeper than alignment. Lysera watched him closely now, not just observing his actions but anticipating them, learning the subtle signs that came before he moved, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his attention shifted before his body did. "It is not over," she said quietly, the realization settling in before the evidence appeared. Ethan did not look at her, his gaze already drifting past the immediate systems, reaching outward into something unseen. No, he replied, and this time there was no calm certainty in it, only focus. The station's hum shifted again, not a fluctuation, not a deviation, but a layering, like multiple signals beginning to overlap in ways they were not designed to. And for the first time Lysera felt it without needing to interpret it, a subtle dissonance that carried through the structure itself. Her systems responded instantly, flooding her awareness with data, cross-checking every subsystem, every relay, every environmental control, and still, everything appeared optimal. "There is no fault," she said, though the words felt almost hollow now. Ethan stepped away from the panel, turning slowly, his movements deliberate, as if mapping something too complex to follow directly. "There does not have to be," he said. "Not yet." He started walking again, faster now, deeper into the core pathways where the station's most critical systems intersected, and this time Lysera did not hesitate at all, matching his pace, her focus narrowing to the same invisible thread he was following. The corridors grew tighter, the air warmer, the hum louder not in volume but in density, layers of functions stacking on top of each other until it became difficult to separate one from another. Ethan slowed near a central conduit where multiple systems fed into a unified control spine, a place designed to balance load distribution automatically, without intervention, without error. He stopped just short of it, his eyes narrowing as if the pattern finally revealed itself. "They are correcting each other," he said, his voice low, almost disbelieving, and then he stepped closer, placing his hand against the conduit, feeling the rapid micro-adjustments happening beneath the surface. Lysera accessed the same system instantly, her data streams expanding, isolating variables, tracking corrections that happened in fractions of a second. "They are maintaining equilibrium," she said, her tone returning to analysis, to logic, to something she could hold on to. Ethan shook his head slightly. "They are overcorrecting," he replied, and then he moved, faster than before, opening a manual interface that had not been accessed in years, his fingers working through controls that required physical input, bypassing layers of automation that were now part of the problem. "If they keep compensating like this," he continued, "they will push each other out of phase." Lysera's systems recalculated, projecting outcomes based on his input, and for the first time, she saw it, not as a current failure, but as a future cascade, a chain of perfectly logical corrections that would eventually destabilize the entire structure. "That would take time," she said, though the projection timelines were already shortening with each recalculation. Ethan adjusted the controls, not shutting anything down, not forcing a reset, but easing the system back into a single reference point, reducing the feedback loops that had begun to amplify each other. "Time is the problem," he said, because no one would see it coming. The conduit's vibrations softened under his hand, the layered dissonance fading into a cleaner, unified hum, and the projections in Lysera's systems shifted instantly, the cascade dissolving before it could form. She stood there, watching the data rewrite itself, watching a future that had never been reported disappear as if it had never existed. "You prevented a system-wide imbalance," she said, the weight of it settling into her voice. Ethan closed the interface and stepped back, the tension leaving his posture in a quiet release. "I delayed it," he corrected, and there was no pride in it, no emphasis, just a simple acknowledgement of reality. Lysera looked at him then, truly looked, not as a worker, not as a variable, but as something her systems had never accounted for, something that did not operate within thresholds or parameters. "Why?" she asked, the question deeper now, not about the system, but about him. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the conduit, to the flow of unseen interactions that would continue long after they left. "Because if I do not," he said, "no one will notice until it is too late." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but absolute, and for the first time Lysera understood that his actions were not driven by function or design, but by something far less efficient and far more powerful, something her entire empire had overlooked because it could not be measured, something that chose to act before it had to, simply because it mattered. The conduit settled into a stable rhythm, the layered interference gone, the system breathing evenly again, and yet Ethan did not move away immediately, his hand still resting lightly against the surface as if he was listening for something deeper, something beyond the immediate correction. Lysera stood beside him, her systems quiet for the first time since she arrived, not because there was nothing to process, but because she had stopped relying on them, her attention shifting entirely to him, to the way he interacted with something she had always treated as controlled, predictable, complete. "You said you delayed it," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that had not been there before. Ethan nodded once, slowly, his gaze drifting along the conduit as if following the flow of something invisible. "Everything drifts," he replied. "Systems, signals, people. You can align it, you can stabilize it, but it does not stay that way on its own." Lysera absorbed the words, not as data, but as something closer to truth, something that did not need verification to matter. Around them, the station continued its endless operation, thousands of processes running in perfect synchronization, each one optimized, efficient, precise, and yet now she could feel the gaps between them, the places where alignment depended on something more than design. "Then why does your system not include this?" she asked, her tone quieter now, almost reflective. "Why is there no function for what you do?" Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a tired laugh, but without humor. "Because what I do is not efficient," he said, stepping back from the conduit at last, his posture relaxing slightly now that the immediate tension had passed. "It takes time, attention, choice. None of those scale well." Lysera looked at him, truly looked, seeing not just the wear on his uniform or the marks on his hands, but the pattern of his movement, the constant readiness, the way he never fully disengaged from the environment around him. "And yet," she said slowly, "without it, the system fails in ways it cannot predict." Ethan met her gaze briefly, then looked past her toward the endless structure of the station. "Not fails," he corrected, "just drifts until it does." The distinction settled heavily between them, subtle but absolute. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with the steady hum of a system that now felt less like a machine and more like something alive, something that required more than perfection to remain whole. Then, for the first time, Lysera did something her systems had never required of her. She reached out and placed her hand against the conduit where his had been, feeling the faint vibration beneath the surface, the steady rhythm he had restored. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but now that she knew it was there, she could not ignore it. "I did not know it could feel like this," she said, more to herself than to him. Ethan watched her for a moment, something unreadable passing through his expression, then he gave a small nod. "Most people do not try," he said. She withdrew her hand slowly, her thoughts shifting in ways she could not fully map, her understanding of control, of systems, of value itself beginning to realign. "If it cannot be scaled," she said after a moment, "then it cannot support an empire." Ethan turned away slightly, his gaze moving toward a distant corridor where another faint irregularity was already beginning to form, barely there, almost invisible. "Maybe it is not supposed to," he said quietly. The words lingered, simple but disruptive, and for the first time, Lysera did not try to resolve them into something logical. Instead, she followed him again, not as an observer, not as an owner of the system, but as someone beginning to understand that what he carried was not a function to be replicated, but a choice to be made, one that required something her empire had never valued, something that could not be programmed or enforced. And as they moved deeper into the station once more, she realized that his secret was not hidden because it was complex. It was hidden because it was simple, because it required nothing more than paying attention and choosing to care before anything forced you to. The station moved on as if nothing had changed, as if the countless corrections, the silent alignments, the unseen choices had never happened, and yet everything felt different, not in structure, not in function, but in awareness, at least for one of them. Ethan walked ahead as he always had, steady, attentive, his gaze drifting from one subtle shift to another, never fully at rest, never fully disconnected, because the system never stopped needing him even when it appeared perfect. Behind him, Lysera followed, but not as she had before, not with distance or detachment, but with intention, her attention no longer filtered through layers of data, but grounded in the same quiet observation he had shown her. They reached the viewing platform again, the vast curve of space stretching out before them, Stars scattered across the dark like distant signals waiting to be understood, and this time Ethan stopped, not because something was wrong, but because for the first time, there was nothing immediate demanding his focus. The silence here felt different, not empty, but complete, the system holding its balance without strain, at least for now. Lysera stepped beside him, her gaze moving from the stars to the reflection of the station layered across the glass, a structure she had built, controlled, perfected, and yet only now beginning to understand. "You will continue," she said quietly, not a question, but something closer to acceptance. Ethan gave a small nod, his eyes still on the distant lights. "That is the job," he replied, the same words as before, but now they carried a different weight, something she could finally hear. She studied him for a moment, then looked back out at the stars, her thoughts shifting, reorganizing, not around systems or efficiency, but around something far more difficult to define. "Then I will change the system," she said, the decision forming as she spoke it, not as a command, but as a choice. Ethan glanced at her, not surprised, not impressed, just attentive. "You can try," he said, and there was no doubt in his voice, only honesty. "But it will not be enough." She did not argue, because now she understood why. No system, no matter how advanced, could replace what he did, because what he did was not a function. It was a decision made in moments too small to track, too quiet to record, too human to replicate. "Then I will learn," she said instead, her voice steady. And this time it was not about control, but about change. Ethan watched her for a second longer, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than approval. "That is enough," he said. The words settled into the space between them, simple, final, and something about them felt like a shift not just in her, but in everything she had built. They stood there in silence after that, the station humming around them, balanced for now, stable for now, and somewhere deep within it, a faint irregularity began to form, so small it could not be measured, so quiet it could not be heard by anything but someone who was paying attention. Ethan's head tilted slightly, his gaze sharpening as he caught it instantly, already turning to move before it could grow. He did not hesitate, did not question, did not wait. He simply chose to act. Lysera watched him go, her eyes following his movement as he disappeared back into the living structure of the station, and for the first time, she did not reach for her systems, did not check her data, did not confirm the deviation. Instead, she stood there for one more second, feeling the silence, listening for the shift he had taught her to hear, and then she turned and followed, not because she had to, but because now she understood. He was never meant to control the stars. He was meant to remind them what held them together.